Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Horwat. And we got a little bit of news to kick off the week thanks to Rob Rossi. We'll talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins closing in on a contract extension with Captain Sidney Crosby. And then we're going to touch on, with the whole new world of the Pittsburgh Penguins coming up, we're going to touch on which Penguins are safe from trade speculation moving forward and which ones we expect to finish out their current contract with the organization. We'll close things out with a few off-season superlatives, a couple of fun little questions that we have in there to talk about this offseason. But we're kicking things off with Crosby, so let's get started. Everybody has seemingly talked about Sidney Crosby's future over the last week. We, on this show, mentioned that we almost half expected it to be a 12:01 press release, right? Of Sidney Crosby has signed his extension. But according to multiple reports, including Rob Rossi of The Athletic, Crosby and agent Pat Brisson wanted to give Kyle Dubas his space, allow him to work the majority of the offseason here, or at least the very first week of free agency, shape the roster, and then worry about the contract a little bit later. And everybody seemed to have a field day with that. It's been 1 week since the opening of free agency. Multiple news outlets have gone out with the, well, is Sidney Crosby leaving Pittsburgh story? Where would Sidney Crosby go if he left the Pittsburgh Penguins? Like I mentioned, Rob Rossi of The Athletic shuts those rumors down, as he typically does, saying the Penguins are closing in on a deal with their captain. Here's the direct quote that I wanted to pull from that article, saying, quote, Crosby reaffirmed to Dubas what he has repeatedly stated publicly, that he wants to finish his career with the Penguins, who selected him number 1 in 2005. The potential deal is being viewed by both sides as a, quote, commitment to Pittsburgh. Horwat, what were your thoughts when you read those words from Rob Rossi on Monday afternoon?
These words look familiar. These
Yeah.
are things that I've seen before because it was always expected. Yeah, we were expecting the 12:01 signing or announcement, I guess I should say. And it got to the point where on free agency day, where nothing was happening with him specifically. I don't know if anyone caught TSN Duplinko for a couple of players across the league. Crosby was one of them. Which I get, they're trying to have fun because free agency can have some lulls. And honestly, it was sort of interesting watching the other players go down the Plinko board and then seeing the talking heads debate about what their future should hold. Now, you can believe what you want in Sidney Crosby's future is best served in other towns. You might be right about that when it comes to building the amount of when it comes to building his trophy case. Yeah, that might be what's best for him. But at the same time, and I'll go back to what Frankie Corrado said, that what's best for Crosby's own legacy is staying in Pittsburgh. Maybe it won't fill his trophy room. Maybe it won't add more numbers. It won't add more awards, whatever. But what it does is adds to his legacy and following in the footsteps of the player he took the torch from, the player that from Mario Lemieux. Now it's up to him to hand the torch off to whoever's next for this team, whether we don't know who that is going to be, whether it be someone like Braden Yeager, maybe someone the Penguins haven't even brought in yet. The future of the team is still pretty in the dark, but Crosby will, at bare minimum, be part of it one way or the other forever. You also have to remember Crosby grew up idolizing guys like Lemieux and Steve Yzerman, both of which did that. They played only on one team. So I think the Crosby thing staying in Pittsburgh goes beyond just his loyalty to Pittsburgh, his commitment to Pittsburgh, which we all knew was already there. It is also his own drive. It's just what he wants to do. He is a committed person. He doesn't like change. So all the things were just lining up that they just needed their time. There was no sweat. I think many outside of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh media were really sweating out, oh, well, what is he going to do? Is he going to leave? Is he going to sign this extension? Is there actual talks of him leaving? No, I think everyone within Pittsburgh was just taking it day by day, understanding that it will get done. It's just a matter of when. There's no need to worry here. There never was a need to worry, at least for me and you and for many others that are around the black and gold.
Yeah, the only sweat involving Sidney Crosby is his Euro trip and how warm it was in Europe when he was over there. I mean, he's having himself a summer, and that's really the only story that there is about Sidney Crosby. This extension will get done when it gets done. Seemingly, it is coming soon. And again, that was never in question. And you mentioned in there that you could argue, or there has been the argument that
Yeah.
maybe it's better served for his career, for his legacy, to go somewhere else. I don't think so, especially when you look at the current state of professional sports, right? He's trying to follow in the footsteps of Mario Lemieux. He's trying to follow in the footsteps of Steve Yzerman. But back then, more players did stuff like this. More
Hmm.
players just simply played because there was less movement around the league. Now, in every single league, there is movement constantly. Players leaving teams, no matter how long they've been there. I mean, just for example, look at Steven Stamkos' situation. It's a little bit different because the Tampa Bay Lightning are still going to be a contender next year, and they just simply decided that it's time to move on from their captain. But I never thought that Steven Stamkos was going to go anywhere else but the Tampa Bay Lightning. But here we are. He's a Nashville Predator here on July 9th of 2024. It just goes to show with Crosby, with Malkin, and with Letang, the craziness of having three players do that in this era of professional sports is, it is certainly notable. And I think the fact that Crosby is the spearhead of that, everybody knew that once those other players signed 2 years ago, Crosby wasn't about to say, all right, well, that's fine. You guys fulfill this thing that I've been talking about for 18 to 20 years, and I'm going to go, try to win another Stanley Cup. He has three. I think it's better served for his legacy because he's won everything else there is to win in hockey. He's gonna, break a couple more records, but
Hmm.
closing out his career in one uniform, I think that's better for his legacy than a random fourth cup as a second line center for the Colorado Avalanche or a second line center for who else has been thrown out there?
Montreal.
Montreal. I mean, he'd be a top line center in Montreal, but still, he's not like he's winning a cup in Montreal, right? So,
Yeah.
I think that the argument that his legacy would be better served if he went trophy hunting. He's already hunted and put all the trophies up on his shelf. He doesn't need more of them to secure his legacy. He wants more of them. I guarantee you he does.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that he's willing to part with something that has, as Rossi explains, has meant so much to him both publicly and privately that he would throw that away to try to win one more trophy.
Yeah, it's because whenever you start trophy hunting, then that's when you start bouncing around teams. You start really getting into, who's going to win it this year? Okay, that's where I'm going. You start looking like, no offense to him because he did just re-sign with the same team. But you start looking like Patrick Kane. Already has 3 cups. Well, then he jumps to the Rangers and then to Detroit. But I think, like, yeah, those are the only teams. But there was always talks of him going other places to land on a team that can take him to the Stanley Cup. Like, I think he was linked to Edmonton this past offseason before he re-signed in Detroit, which would have been a good team to go to when it comes to going for the cup because they have the best odds so far, and that's a team that's going to be hungry to go back. And I think what makes this Crosby thing even more interesting, at least when it comes to the discussion of, well, is he going to sign? Is he not going to sign? What's he going to do? This is the furthest in, or like the closest to the end of his deal that the Penguins have ever come.
And it's still a year out.
And it's still a year out. I don't know if that means that's why that panic set in for anyone, if it did at all. The last contract he signed, or at least the latest that he had ever signed one, was his 5-year deal after his ELC when he signed on July 7th. That was 2 days ago. So we are past that point of, well, what are we going to do with Crosby's future? Still, yeah. He's always signed a year in advance. He's always had that net of he's going to stay, he's going to extend, and he's going to be here for the rest of his career. Once this new contract gets announced, of course, nothing is official until it is announced and official. It'll be all just the discussions of, well, here's his legacy in Pittsburgh. Here's where he's going to stay. Once he retires, what does he do next? The Penguins will, I'm sure, happily offer him any position he wants. I doubt anything in the front office would come right away, but I could see developmental stuff. I could see some sort of mentoring or coaching. We'll see. The future is going to be bright for Pittsburgh with Crosby in it, no matter if it's on the ice, off the ice, in a suit, whatever it is.
Yeah, and that was part of Rossi's article as well. So I encourage you, if you haven't read it and you do have access to The Athletic, go check that piece out because there's a lot of insight from my buddy Rob over at The Athletic. Let's move over and with that, talk about which Penguins are going to finish off their contract with the Penguins because, you know, you look at Crosby, it's fully expected he's going to sign that extension. He's going to end his career with the Pittsburgh Penguins. The Penguins have a lot of contracts right now that are very long. And that puts into question how many of these players are actually going to reach the end of that deal, or will they be traded? Because you look at what the Penguins are doing right now. They're entering a weird time. They're trying to rebuild quickly. What does that look like? Who ends up on the chopping block because of that? There's a lot of one-year deals being signed this summer in particular. But before all of this began, there were a lot of commitments made by previous regimes. There were some commitments made by this front office staff, Kyle Dubas, Jason Spezza, and a lot of them. So we're going to go down through 5 names here of players that have some interesting circumstances coming up over the next couple of seasons, some of them this year, some of them a little further in the future, and ask the question, which of them will actually make it through the end of their contract? And let's start with somebody who I think going into this year is 100% staying on the Pittsburgh Penguins for multiple reasons. But I think that after this year, it gets a little interesting. And that's Bryan Rust.
Mm-hmm.
He has 4 years remaining on that contract, which lines up directly with Chris Letang, which lines up reportedly with what Sidney Crosby is going to sign for, which is a 3-year contract. But he has a full no-move clause this season and then nothing after this for the next 3 years. Do you think Bryan Rust makes it to the end of that, what was a 6-year deal when he signed it a couple seasons back?
I don't know. I know the team loves Bryan Rust. I know he's a great player for this team. He plays really well with Sidney Crosby, plays really well with Evgeny Malkin whenever he gets that chance. But just considering the direction the Penguins are going in, considering the cap hit he carries, it is kind of large for sometimes an inconsistent player. And whenever you have the ability just to sort of wash your hands of it and send him wherever, there is no clauses whatsoever. I don't even know about next season, 25-26, if that's when it would happen. I could see closer to the last 2 years of it being the time for Bryan Rust to be sent to the happy trails. And again, it's nothing against Bryan Rust. It is just me kind of looking as much as I can into the crystal ball of the Penguins, which is the future isn't super bright. And if it comes time to start selling off important pieces for as big of a return as possible, I know Bryan Rust will be in his mid-30s. That's probably the first domino to fall, just because he's not part of the core and may still have some production left in him and is a decent amount of money coming off the cap.
Yeah, you look at last season, he was a 30-goal scorer, even though he didn't reach that. If he was healthy, he's a 30-goal scorer. Yeah. So by 2026, he's at the very least going to be a pretty decent goal-scoring bottom 6 guy that if you can get some good value for in return, it would make sense to use him as a trade piece. Now, I understand that there is a lot of love for Bryan Rust in Pittsburgh. I mean, the guy was part of 2 Stanley Cup teams. He was Mr. Game 7 in the Eastern Conference Finals back in 2016. Both goals being scored by him. I mean, he's a playoff performer that, if he's healthy, plays in all 3 aspects of the game and can really help your team. Now, again, the Penguins right now, they're in a weird position because they're trying to rebuild, but they're trying to give the team on the ice an opportunity to play above their skis and to get into the playoffs on their own merits. Bryan Rust is a big part of that, right? And Sidney Crosby losing Jake Gensel, he's going to want to lean on Bryan Rust. They're going to want to have him lean on Bryan Rust, especially right now when they don't have that other winger on the other side of things. It's Drew O'Connor as of right now again. So I do think that there's a good chance that his trade value is just too good to pass up, especially for a team that, if they're going into a rebuild right now, we'll see where it's at in the future. Again, that's what the unpredictable part of this is where do they end up coming from? Like, is Ville Koivunen going to be a bona fide NHL or top 6 guy in the near future? Is Braden Yeager going to make that jump and make it so easily and so smoothly that it almost makes not trading Brian Rust seem like it's a misstep. So I think there's a lot of things that go into this conversation, but I do think that there's a chance that Brian Rust does not make it to the end of that 4-year contract. Let's move over and talk about somebody that was brought in by Kyle Dubas and the current front office staff. Erik Karlsson has 3 more seasons left. Again, similar to Brian Rust, we all agree that he's not going anywhere this year. Honestly, and I'll get into this, he's probably not going anywhere next season as well, but he has 3 more years at full no-move clause on it. What do you think about Erik Karlsson's future with the organization?
I think this was pretty close to set in stone. That last year of the deal could get interesting depending on the direction the Penguins are in, because that lines up with about the time that I think Brian Rust would be sent out as well. So the Penguins would have this upcoming season, 24-25, and then the following season, 25-26, lining up with the Malkin thing to really figure it out. And if things aren't working out going into 26-27, here comes the real teardown. And I could see Erik Karlsson being a part of that. But at the same time, it depends on how good of a player he looks and where the team is at.
Mm-hmm.
I would say at the moment, also he'd be an aged veteran, depending on what the first few seasons looked like. Maybe you just kind of go, all right, fine, walk to free agency. I don't think we're uber worried about it. I could see him finishing this one out, though. I think I'd be more inclined to say Karlsson finishes this one just because age, that's a lot of money, a ton of money to try and trade, even a couple years down the line, knowing what the salary cap may be. But for an aged veteran with a full no-move clause, it was hard to get him here in the first place. So I would say Karlsson finishes his out.
Yeah, I would say the only other aspect of that would be that last year. If he's saying, all right, this is it, and then he wants to go back and play for Ottawa, or he wants to go back and play for San Jose, maybe. I mean, they might be on the upswing and with Macklin Celebrini and Will Smith at that point. But again, that's one that, for the time being, there is no conversations being had about Erik Karlsson on the trade block. If you're on your last season and everything else is looking like, the Penguins are trying to rebuild, they could use any other asset that they can. They're not going to get into the playoffs for the 5th straight season. God forbid that happens. Then, yeah, I could see him being moved on from. But not as plainly and not as clearly as some of these other players. Speaking of plainly and clearly, Rickard Rakell is on this list. 4 more seasons on that contract. An 8-team no-trade list for the duration. I would be surprised if he wasn't moved out, honestly, in the next 2 seasons.
Yeah. This summer might even be possible. You never know. I'd say there's almost no way he doesn't get dealt before the end of the contract. And maybe if the years line up, maybe bought out at some point. I don't know. There's a lot left on it. The buyout conversation probably wouldn't happen until
2 years left. Yeah.
Yep, until that famous 2-year window that we're going to bring up probably with everything we talk about now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I just don't foresee him finishing this contract here. It was long when he was given it in the beginning. I think the money was fine considering the year he was coming off of. But Ron Hextall just was handing out 6-year contracts like they were candy at the time.
Yeah, he gave out a lot of term that offseason. You go back and look at it. Brian Rust gets 6. Rickard Rakell gets 6.
Letang got 6.
Letang got 6. Kenny Malkin got 4. And that's why it was so crazy is they were haggling over 3 versus 4 with Malkin, but he just gave 6 to 3 other players, including a guy in Rickard Rakell who, listen, that first year of the deal was great. 27 goals, 11 on the power play. Last year was not. There was some frustration with Rickard Rakell's performance. And I think as you look at him, the second that they're able to offload him for positive assets, I could see it happening, especially because you don't want to get stuck with a piece like that who, yeah, I like Rakell. I think he's a solid middle 6 winger, but at the same time, 4 more seasons at that cap hit, whenever you're trying to rebuild, you're trying to bring in assets. If you can get him to be a 27, 28 goal scorer again next year with only 3 seasons left, you might be able to offload it to somebody. Again, that might end up having to be a retained salary. I don't think a buyout would be worth it, especially, you probably do the calculator. It's probably out until like 2032 or something like that because buyout calculators are ridiculous. But 4 more seasons seems to be a heck of a lot to imagine Rickard Rakell not being traded in that time. Now, again, he had 1 down year. I fully expect him to bounce back. It sounds like the Penguins do as well. But again, 4 more seasons seems like a lot for Rickard Rakell in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's just a bit much. That's all. And nothing wrong with it. If he turns things around, I mean, then maybe we have a different discussion. But at the moment, it's just not, as we look at it right now, it's not something that I would expect finishing up.
If he turns things around, I'm of the mindset now. I'm in the rebuilding mindset. I'm saying, all right, well, what's his value now at this
Yeah.
point? Because anything that is not nailed down, and there are very few things nailed down in this organization, should be thought of in that light. And, speaking of something like that, let's talk about Marcus Pettersson here. He's heading into a contract season. His value around the league has to be very high, but his value to the Pittsburgh Penguins is currently very high as well. He is the only, I don't even want to call it a sure thing because nothing is a sure thing in hockey, but he is the closest thing to a sure thing on the Penguins' left side of the defense, bar none. Heading into a contract year, has an 8-team no-trade list. Do you think Marcus Pettersson makes it, or, I mean, obviously there's extension talks that we would have to go through this summer, but do you think he makes it to the end of this contract before being traded? Do you think there's a chance that they say, hey, go into a contract year and we may or may not end up dealing you at some point before the deadline?
That's Marcus Pettersson is a fascinating one because there's already extension talks. So you think he's going to stick around, but for what? But for what again? Because the Penguins are in a weird spot. They're in that spot of if they can turn things around this year, this upcoming season, well, they could be right back in the playoffs. They were for the past 2 years right on the cusp of it. But then he's a UFA. Marcus Pettersson has then followed that up with a UFA. He's also not the kind of player you're going to approach and say, here's a 1-year deal. Here's a 2-year extension. You're just not going to do that because he is so skilled and has great talent that it would be a tough sell for him. You also don't want to feel like you're lowballing him. But then if you give him a big, long deal, then it turns into why? So that is an interesting one. I would say he finishes it out. I would say he ends up getting the extension. If anything, it maybe comes clause-free. And if things, fall off a cliff, hey, we're free to move you. Just letting you know. We're free to move you if things get bad. We want you to be a winner. So I could see Marcus Pettersson finishing out the deal he's on now at a little over $4 million, signing an extension of sorts, and then going from there. That's a tough one to nail down, but I'm looking at it optimistically.
Yeah, when you look at who the Penguins have as trade chips as of right now, perhaps none higher or potentially bringing back more than a guy like Marcus Pettersson. Obviously, you have your Crosbys, your Malkins, but those are guys, like I mentioned earlier, nailed to the floorboards, not going anywhere. Marcus Pettersson on a contract year, there's a lot of teams that would overpay for his services, especially if you get to the trade deadline and certain teams, I look at a team like the Devils. If they were in a better position last year, they might have been buying defensive defensemen because Dougie Hamilton was hurt a lot of the season. They needed better defense. Obviously, you saw what they did this offseason, trading out Marino, bringing guys like Brett Pesce, like Brendan Dillon. So there's a lot of teams that would certainly inquire about his services. It becomes a very interesting conversation with the contract extension talks, right?
Yep.
And I think that goes to show with the quote that we talked about last week from Kyle Dubas saying, this is not a tear it down to the studs operation here. The guys in the locker room are too good for that. Are the guys in the locker room too good to get rid of pretty much the only consistent performer on the left side of the defense that they have? That's going to be an interesting story to follow. And again, I don't really know the answer to it, but I do think that if you're looking at this from a pure rebuild standpoint, there is not many better pieces than Marcus Pettersson to trade. And again, like you mentioned, why are you signing him to that? What should be a long-term extension. That's what Pettersson's looking for. That's where he's at, the stage of his career that he's at. It's certainly going to be one of the more interesting storylines late into this summer as we get set for NHL training camp. The last name I have on this list, and this might be somebody that you could argue is nailed to the floorboard, but I think with the amount of years left, it does call it into question a little bit. Chris Letang signed that contract, and the social media post was Penguin for life. 4 more seasons, full no-move clause for the next 2, then a 10-team no-trade list for the final 2 seasons after that vaunted 2-year gap that we have right now that we've mentioned multiple times. Do you think that it is a guarantee that Chris Letang finishes out those next 4 years with the Penguins?
The Chris Letang one is interesting because he can give you a lot of return if you feel like the team isn't going anywhere, especially down that 2-year window. But I think he's going to live in that same sort of Sidney Crosby mindset of Penguin for life, like that social media post said. And I could see Chris Letang, for better or worse, finishing out that deal. That's just my personal opinion. Again, looking a little optimistically at it, looking a little homerism at it too. But there would be something extremely special about where 20 years down the line, all three of the core have obviously retired at this point and are working other jobs in hockey. Whenever we can all look back and go, those three, much like many of the Yankees, much like many of the Red Sox from way back when, other legendary trios, all played all their years with one team. I think it's an interesting conversation with Letang, especially now that things might go south. But I could see it. We're all having the conversation one day. Man, those three, just the Penguins for life. Here's what they brought us. Here are the numbers. Sure, all the cups may have ended in 17, but memories that'll last a lifetime. Even if Letang didn't play in one of them, still.
Yeah, if it came down to picking one or the other, obviously you'd take Letang over Karlsson for storyline reasons. But again, who's performing better, right? Last year, I think you could argue either side of those things, right? I think you could argue Chris Letang early in the season was better. I think you could argue down the stretch that Erik Karlsson was better. But I think when you look at both of those two players, it gets really interesting on your blue line, because if you're trying to rebuild and that year after whatever it is, 2026, 27, and you're saying, all right, this is the year that we're going to spend and go for it, you still have $17 million locked up on the right side. And at that point, it's 35-year-old Karlsson, 39-year-old, 40-year-old Chris Letang, wherever he ends up being at that point. It is interesting. But I think there's obviously the next 2 years, which I don't think anybody in that core is going anywhere for the next 2 years. And that is until Malkin's done. And I think there are questions that crop up. But I think if Crosby signs a 3-year deal specifically, I think there is some significance to that lining up with Chris Letang's deal. I do think there was some inside baseball that was happening behind the scenes between these guys saying, Chris Letang, when his contract was up, hey, if you get a 6-year deal, Sid might get a 3-year deal after he's done. And then that lines you guys up to finish your careers off at the same time. Whereas, you look at where the situation is now, it certainly looks like it could be that way. So Letang's an interesting one, definitely. But I think there's only one team that he would go to if he was traded, which again, lessens the chance that the Penguins want to trade him, because that perceived value in return is probably not there, because, he's probably only going to be, especially at 38, 39 years old, probably only going to be on the radar of one team, and that's probably the Montreal Canadiens. But again, that's taking a jump. That's just my assumption. But that is where we stand here with all of these 5 players that we just discussed as potentially making it to the end of their contract or not. I think the only ones that we said are close to definite is Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson. Everybody else with this new era of Penguins hockey, this, pseudo rebuild, I guess we could call it. I don't know. It's hard to label, because Kyle Dubas is not committing to a tear it down to the studs rebuild, but at the same time, his actions speak as if he is a rebuilding general manager. So we'll keep an eye on, obviously, all of these things. They're long-term storylines here, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how the careers of these players are changed by the next couple of seasons of Penguins hockey. Let's finish things off with some off-season superlatives, just a couple of fun questions to close out the show. First and foremost, Horwat, which player is most likely to be traded before this season? Now, it doesn't have to be any of the players we just mentioned, but when you look at the Penguins on paper now, is there anybody that is most likely to be traded before, maybe not even training camp, but game 1 in October?
I'm going to keep going toward Tristan Jarry for this sort of question as my answer. I really do. It's just the way that the Penguins, or at least Kyle Dubas, might still want to bring in a top line winger, might still want to make moves for bolstering this team, because he doesn't want to do the full teardown. And like I said, the Penguins still have a chance of making that sneaky playoff run if they can find an extra bit of scoring and find more consistent goaltending. I get what I just said about trading away Tristan Jarry, but are they committed to him? I know they signed that contract, but did they have any real choice? They were taking a flyer on Nedeljkovic coming in. They weren't ready for Blomqvist yet, definitely. And Jari was a free agent. And again, much like Pettersson, you're not going to lowball him. You're not going to say, here's a year so you can try it out. Even Korpisalo had to sign multiple years. So I could see Jari being among the top faces still to be dealt by the Penguins before the season starts, mostly because I think they're going to start the year with Raquel. Don't see Graves going anywhere, period, anytime soon. And that about wraps it up for trade pieces. They dealt Riley Smith. Lars Eller is interesting, but there's still some questions to be had. And that's just kind of why I fall on Tristan Jarry.
The interesting thing about Jarry, and I would have agreed with you 3 weeks ago, but I feel like a lot of time has passed, and I feel like a lot of the pieces, especially goaltending pieces, have come off the board. Who's left? Like you mentioned it there. They want more consistent goaltending. Not to say Tristan Jarry is consistent, because I think he's actually the antithesis of that, but more so than a lot of the names that are still available, right? There's not a lot in the free agent pool. There's certainly not a lot in the trade market, and you'd have to swing another trade to bring a goaltender in. I think that's just a lot of work to be done. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I just think that the longer it goes, obviously, we've already hit past free agency. We've already hit past the first 2 waves of goaltending trades. I don't see it coming in a way that benefits the Penguins, because then you're looking at guys like John Gibson, who, no, you're putting yourself in the similar situation, if not a worse situation, with the contract and the performance from John Gibson. So it is a rocky road if you decide to go with the goaltending switch up at this point of the offseason. It's like everything else that Kyle Dubas has faced. It's possible, but it's going to take some really fine work from him to come out smelling like roses on the other side of that venture. And that's why I go in a different direction. You mentioned Lars Eller. I think Lars Eller is the most likely to be traded. I would put Noel Acciari above him, but at the same time, I think, one, Acciari has 2 years left on that contract, which is still unbelievable. And Eller is on a contract year. And 2, Eller had the better of the 2 seasons. And I think more teams would be open to acquiring his services. Not only that, but giving up more for his services this offseason. I like Lars Eller. I think that it's great that they were able to find, whether it's Kevin Hayes, whoever, somebody to go in that third line center role so they could bump Eller down and put him in a better position to succeed. But I also think this is a team that, if they can get a 3rd round pick, a 2nd round pick for Lars Eller, you pull that trigger. Or if you can get a prospect that is half decent, maybe a little bit further out, maybe a team is kind of soured on that prospect and they're like, well, he needs a new system. He's in a crowded system potentially. I think that that's the type of trade that Lars Eller would be involved in, and that's why I think he's most likely to be traded this offseason.
Yeah, I don't hate that one either. Like we mentioned, he's been in those talks already. He's already been mentioned among names of Penguins that could be dealt. And you're right. I feel like with time passing, everyone feels a bit less inclined to be traded. But we do have to remember that I forget when the Carlson trade happened now.
August 6th of 2023.
But it was in August. So there is still time to wheel and deal and figure things out, to pull everyone out of their cottages for a day to announce a trade. It's for the Penguins. It was a long off season, and there's still plenty of time to do plenty of work.
Yeah, I think it was the 6th. It was the first week of August for sure, because it was right before my wedding. I was like, well, I appreciate you doing it now.
Okay, got it.
But yeah, no, there's still plenty of time for trades to happen. I just don't know about restructuring an entire position, and that's what they would do with the Jarry one. But again, we all said it as soon as Nedeljkovic signed that deal. Oh, that means Jarry is out of here. And then crickets. Part of that might be the market for a goaltender that has not performed well past January 1st over the past 5 seasons of his career. Let's move over and talk about this one. Which new Penguin is most likely to succeed, Horwat?
It's tough to tell because the new Penguins that they've brought in aren't necessarily going to show on paper and show in the scoring stats success. I would say my early option is going to be Blake Lizotte. He's got the 2-year deal under him, so they're a little bit more confident in what he can bring. And when it comes to success in this situation, it really is just being a good player that can be useful in multiple assets of the game.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't just going to be a couple of goals here and there. It's going to be shutting down opposing offenses, helping out the bottom six improve and get back to some normalcy. Just the way of, like, when you consider the word success, you're thinking of, well, who's going to score the most? That might be possible, and the Penguins still have time to pull something like that off and make both of our answers null and void. But for now, the way I see it is Blake Lizotte should come in and play that full, well-rounded game for the Penguins' bottom six. It's just needed help for the last few seasons now.
Yeah, most likely to succeed in their role. You know, nobody mistakes Jeff Carter's role last year for a role of a guy that should score 30 goals, right? So that's a similar position for a guy like Blake Lizotte, who's coming in to be a fourth liner to start. Maybe he, goes off and becomes a third liner for the Penguins, third line center, and bumps Kevin Hayes down, which again would be great, especially with a young guy like Blake Lizotte who could be part of that future of the Penguins. He's only in his mid-20s. But I'm going to go with somebody different. I'm going to go in my gut. For some reason, I feel like this player is not going to, like you mentioned, he's not going to be a 25 goal scorer. But what I think he's going to do is get back to the game that he was when he was at his best with the New York Islanders, and that's Anthony Beauvillier. For some reason, I feel like the fit here, I feel like the coaching staff here, and I feel like the opportunity here is going to all work out for a guy like Anthony Beauvillier. And I think that it's going to turn into him being, again, this is not a strong class by any means when it comes to the Pittsburgh Penguins free agency class, but I think that he has a chance to top it as of right now. I mean, you look at Blake Lizotte, I'm excited about what the future holds for him. You look at a guy like Matt Grzelcyk, there are many questions about what he's able to do, but these are a lot of players that are looking for a fresh start to get back to what they were. And I think of those players, I really like the opportunity that Anthony Beauvillier has with the Pittsburgh Penguins, a bottom six guy that could potentially, he could end up succeeding and becoming a trade piece by the end of the season. But I do like the opportunity that he has in Pittsburgh, and I like his fit in the Penguins' new bottom six.
I also just really like the idea of going against what everyone thought of Anthony Beauvillier when he was signed. Love it. This is great. Everyone was down on him, even whenever the rumors were going around that he was going to sign here. Where did we put him? We put him in our top 10 faces to watch. What did the Penguins do?
They went out two.
Yeah, they put him in the top. We put him in the top 3. And what did the Penguins do? They went out and got him.
Mm-hmm.
So, A, maybe our crystal ball isn't that bad. B, yeah, if he can do the thing, then he's gonna be pretty good here. And I like the idea of him succeeding in his role, especially considering everyone has been doubting him since the start.
Yeah, and what could his role potentially be by the start of the season? Fourth line left wing, right? If the Penguins go out and get another left winger, that bumps O'Connor down to the third line, and Beauvillier is not going to be starting higher than O'Connor in the lineup. Fourth line left wing, a scoring left wing. If he goes out there and puts 15 goals, you're looking at that as an unmitigated success, as long as he's not a complete liability on the back end. So I'm intrigued to see what Anthony Beauvillier does, but I think that I would label him most likely to succeed of the current crop of free agents. Let's finish this off with most likely to make his Penguins debut first. I got 3 names here for you, Horwat. Ville Koivunen, who's right now skating at UPMC Lemieux Complex with the prospect development camp. A Vasily Ponomarev, who came over in that trade as well last year for Jake Gensel, or Joel Blomqvist, the netminder that as of right now sits 3rd on the organizational depth chart.
Nah, he's going to be sitting 2nd soon.
If you get what you're thinking, yes.
You see where my answers tie in now.
Yes.
I took Jari because I think there might be some belief that Joel Blomqvist can start the season as the backup. Now, that is an extremely hot take, and we'll probably get some cold water tossed on it very quickly. But if Jari is going to be my trade piece, I think that just makes Joel Blomqvist the easy answer for this question, at least, of who makes their Penguins debut first. I could see Blomqvist, because he's already served his backup a couple times. He could have already notched it, by the way. Thankfully no injuries occurred or anything like that, but he could have already had his first game under his belt. So they're going to go into this season. Maybe he's the backup. Maybe he's a carrying around on the roster 3rd string also. Doubtful. The only way that he becomes their second string, obviously, is if the Penguins make a deal with Jari, which I still think is possible. So sliding him in as that easy option of he'll be on the NHL roster to start. I mean, it's possible Ponomarev or Koivunen are too, but I think Blomqvist strikes me as the most likely.
Mm-hmm.
And out of those three, I could see him playing for the Penguins first.
Yeah, he certainly has the fewest roadblocks. There's two guys ahead of him, and one of them, all he has to do is jump one of them, and he'll be a guy that starts at least every other week. So there's certainly less roadblocks, but I'm going to go with one of the forwards, and I'm going to stick with Vasily Ponomarev, a guy who has more experience on North American ice. I think that gives him a little bit of a head start on Ville Koivunen, and also, both of those two are going to get opportunities in training camp to potentially show why they deserve to be on the opening night roster, to be in the opening night lineup. I just feel like with the experience factor for Vasily Ponomarev, a guy that they expected to play in NHL games last year if he didn't get injured, I just feel like he's going to be the guy to go simply because I think they like Joe Blomqvist. I do. And I think he is going to get NHL experience and NHL time next year. But I think these other guys are going to get opportunities earlier in the season. I think that they want to be cautious with Blomqvist because even though Mershev's coming up from behind him, and even though Mershev made the trip over for prospect development camp, I do think they want to be a little bit more cautious with a goaltending prospect than they do with a couple of forwards that are, one, has already made an NHL debut, and two, has already torn up professional hockey over in Europe. So I'm going to go with Ponomarev on this one. I think it's close. I think there's a chance that any of these three could end up being the actual answer to this, but I'm going to go with Ponomarev as we sit here today.
I wouldn't be shocked to see all three of them play this year at one point or another.
Yeah.
So, it's just a matter of who gets there first, who wins the race. That's all. Like I said, I could see all three making it, just a matter of when and how the depth chart rolls out. There's still an entire preseason ahead and training camp to really decide what order everyone's going in.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting back half of the summer. You still have the Crosby extension that will happen here in the next couple of weeks, I would venture to guess. Yeah. You have the goaltending resolution, which might be anticlimactic. It might just be Jari Nedeljkovic, which I think a lot of Penguins fans would not be happy about. And you still need a top-line winger. Whoever that may be, whatever that may end up being, they need somebody. Whether that's somebody who's already in the organization and steps up and nobody's looking at the moment. Maybe that's a Koivunen. Maybe that's a Ponomarev. Maybe that's a Braden Yeager. Who knows? Or maybe they go out there and make a pretty big trade. There's a couple big names left on the trade market. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.